everyone, and welcome to today's installment of Intermodal Analyzed, the last of the series for 2022. We'll look at how things are in intermodal and maybe make a peek over the horizon with Larry. But why don't we go ahead and get started? I am pleased to welcome today good friend and intermodal expert, Larry Gross, who is the president and founder of Gross Transportation Consulting. Anyone who's joined us before, Larry needs no introduction, but I always do love to introduce him because I just get a kick out of it, especially those of you who know him as the Intermodalist, one of the cooler handles out there, but well-deserved. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Larry and have him give us an update on what's happening in intermodal. Larry?
Thank you for allowing me once again to be a part of this great educational series that IANA puts on. It's a great pleasure to be with everybody today. Happy holidays. Here we are approaching the end of what has been quite an eventful year, filled with, I'd say, some fairly unexpected developments, and I suspect they're not over yet. Here's my contact information. If there are questions that we don't get to, feel free to reach out to me at lgross@intermodalinDepth.com. I see I still have the Twitter handle on here. Actually, I have shifted my activities over primarily to LinkedIn, given some of the chaos that's occurring right now on Twitter. So best that you follow me over there, also under the Intermodalist name. Okay, so what we're going to do here is, as usual, go through a few slides that tell us what's been going on recently, and then we'll dip into a couple of pieces of analysis that I've been doing, and I'll share that with you. So here's our normal monthly revenue movement slide based on the IANA ETSO database, equipment type, size, and ownership, which allows us to segment the market by equipment type, and that's what you're seeing here, with the monthly volumes as declared by ETSO on that left-hand chart. The red is the total intermodal activity, keying off the left-hand side of that chart, and the green is domestic, the blue is IPI or international, keying off the right-hand axis. And what you see there is that we did see a bit of a rebound in October from September, more so on the domestic side than on the international side. But as we covered last time during the Intermodal Analyzed, this measure is affected quite heavily by what the working days are and what the holiday situation is from month to month. And so I like to adjust for all of that, which is the chart that you see on the right-hand side here. Same data, just adjusted for the number of working days and holidays. And that gives us, I think, a little bit clearer vision of what's actually going on. And I would say what's going on is that we're seeing a trailing off of the IPI situation that has been taking place really, I think, since April. We saw a tick up in July, and that was the one real month of increase. And since then, it's resumed going down. We saw an earlier turn in the domestic situation, which descended quite steadily all the way from the high water mark in March down to September. But we did, in fact, see a little bit of an uptick, or actually, I would say a fairly significant uptick in October, but nothing like what I'll call normal peak season. And I see no reason to expect that that will get November, when the November numbers come in here in about another 4 or 5 days. I would be surprised to see if they're equal to October. So I suspect that at the end of the day, the peak season for domestic in 2022 will have occurred in March, and for international in April. So here are the year-over-year comps. And as usual, we have the monthly comparisons in that chart on the left, and then we go into drill down a little bit by the various equipment types on that table on the right. The chart on the left being moves per average workday, the table on the right being actual straight unadjusted IANA ETSO numbers. And we have now recorded the third month in a row of year-over-year deficits in domestic here in October. Not so with international. We see a positive comparison with prior year in international. And that has more to do with what's going on last year at this time than this year, because last year at this time, this is when we started to see the big plunge in IPI volume as the ocean carriers turned the spigot off. And so we're going to see some really dramatic year-over-year gains here as we go through the balance of 2022 and into the first part of the first quarter of 2023. We're going to see some really strong year-over-year comps on the international side. But don't be mistaken, that's not a situation that says that this year is particularly strong, but rather that last year was particularly weak at this point. So if you look at the table, the international, where we were just slightly up from September to October, and about a 3% gain on a year-over-year basis for October, but year-to-date we're still well in the red, 7%, and that even with strong year-over-year gains for the balance of 2022, I don't expect that we're going to break into the black on a year-to-date basis once the full year numbers are in. And in fact, the only segment that has a positive year-to-date comparison is the private domestic container fleet, which is up 8% year-to-date. And even with the relatively difficult situation that we have in October, still up 4.5% roughly. But this is being completely offset by the performance of the rail domestic container fleet and the trailer fleet. So if you look at the bottom line there in green, the domestic year-over-year number down 4.4% for October and 0.3% year-to-date. Now, one thing I will point out on the rail domestic container side is if you look at the month-to-month number, rail domestic container was up over 11% from September to October, much stronger gain from the prior month than you saw on the private side, even though it was not nearly sufficient, as you see on the year-over-year, to bring it back up to prior year levels. There's still about a 15% deficit. Now, that big increase in rail domestic container was very market specific. It really took place in the cross-border U.S.-Mexico market and the intra-Mexico market is where that rail domestic container gain seemed to occur for the most part. Well, one more thing I'll point out here, on a year-over-year basis, the grand total intermodal slightly in the red by just a little bit less than 1%, and year-to-date we're still down 3.7%. So, I guess I would say that's a pretty disappointing outcome for a year that we expected to be somewhat of a recovery year as we got our service situation back under control. And so now we look at the AAR numbers, which are telling us what's happened so far in November and the first week of December. And if you look at that heavy black line, which is the 4-week moving average for the US, that's always going to be affected to a certain extent by the Thanksgiving Day holiday. And that's what you see, that big plunge in the light black line. That's the weekly trend, really plunged for Thanksgiving. That's normal. But if you look at the year-over-year deficits, which are the red bars, on the U.S., we're seeing some very significant, 5% plus year-over-year deficit. And I attribute a significant piece of that to the jitters that were associated with the potential for a U.S. rail strike. And perhaps we will see, I'll be interested to see tomorrow what that year-over-year deficit starts to look like now that threat was put to bed last week. And so we have almost, I believe, a full week of non-strike threatened activity, and hopefully we'll start to see a little bit of a return for folks that were trying to keep their freight out of the system in the fear of it being trapped by a labor stoppage. On the right, the Canadian situation looks a lot more normal from a seasonal perspective, not completely, because you still don't see the highest peak in the late third, early fourth quarter like you would normally, but it sure looks a lot more normal than we have here in the US. And you see those very large year-over-year gains in the most recent couple of weeks in Canada. And the reason for that is if you look back a year ago at this time, the lines in British Columbia were severed for these couple of weeks by flooding. So here again, more a situation of looking at what happened last year than any current strength And if you look at the trend is certainly heading south. That's nothing unusual at this time of year. You'd kind of expect to see that. The ringer is that these big year-over-year gains are a bit of a statistical anomaly. So what's happening at our ports? Well, we're starting to see the end of the giant surge that began as we came out of the pandemic lockdowns and has persisted for all of this time. And now we're finally starting to see daylight in terms of reduced year-over-year import numbers. We have never really seen much of a recovery on the export side. Those are the green bars and the green line. But now we're seeing the import TEUs dip down below, in a meaningful way, dip down below where they were last year at this time. And we're somewhere in the 7-8% deficit range here in October. So things are definitely slowing down. The ship queues have disappeared off the West Coast, not yet off of the East Coast, but that indeed is only a matter of time. And so let's take a look at what's going on here in terms of the coastal share and the different trends that are happening, because this is significant from an intermodal perspective. The left-hand chart takes a look at the last 3 months of activity, which would be the 3-month period ending in October, and looks at the year-over-year import TEUs by major port and coastal region. So, for instance, if you look at the left-hand bar there, LA Long Beach over the last 3 months has been down 20% year over year. And the Pacific Northwest has been down 16%, Northern Cal holding its own with just a 3% decline. If you put it all together, the US West Coast, which is in red there, is 18% down year over year. Western Canada is in line with Northern Cal, down just a little bit, 3%. So if you put that into the mix, the whole Western North American volume is down about 15% versus prior year over the last 3 months. Situation in the East is completely different. We're still seeing decent gains, and I would say actually you would have to go strong gains year over year in the Northeast and the Southeast, 7% and 6% respectively, and a huge gain, 17% in the Gulf, which generates an 8% overall gain for the I'll call it the Eastern Coast, Gulf and East Coast, which results in a 4% overall decline with regard to overall TEUs. The right-hand chart just takes this data and cuts it a different way and looks at what was the share for those 3 months of imports last year versus this year. And you see the scope of the decline that's occurring in the West Coast and the scope of the gain that's occurring on the East Coast. US West Coast share in particular down from 41.7 last year to 35.5. That's a big swing, and a commensurate increase in share on the East and Gulf Coast, up from 49.9 to 56%. And right now, the biggest container port in the US is New York, New Jersey, beating out LA again in October. And that is probably a trend that's going to continue for some time. So we're seeing a major west to east migration. And from an overall intermodal perspective, that is a bit of a headwind because intermodal share off of the East Coast is lower than off the West Coast. Length of haul is shorter. The flows are more dispersed and more complex, and so less amenable to the PSR IPI strategy of running big trains from point to point. And so this is a bit of an intermodal challenge, a challenge which is not being felt evenly by the different railroads. Obviously, the Western railroads are feeling it more acutely than the Eastern railroads are. If we look at some of the other components here, what's happening on the dray side and on the intermodal service side, I'd say the picture is one of stability, but not necessarily recent improvement. We have had a sort of an improving trend, and the initial indications are that it's starting to level off. We can certainly see that in the drayage demand index, which has kind of been marking time here through September, October. We saw the big dip there, which is Thanksgiving week. That's just a normal phenomena and it then rebounded back up to about where it was before. So it looks like it's a stabilizing situation. The market certainly isn't in meltdown like it was before, but nor is it necessarily loose. I think that, as I indicated to you the last time we spoke, the drayage demand index may be a little bit artificially inflated right now because we're measuring the number of clicks. And I think a good portion of these clicks are not necessarily folks looking for capacity, but perhaps folks looking for price. And so it may be that 420, and in fact, I suspect it is, that 420 number is a little bit inflated. But this is the best that we have at the moment. So I think where the usefulness of this index is when you see trends either upward or downward that are fairly significant, that's telling you something's going on in the market. When we look at the intermodal service levels, we had seen, I think, some improving trends on most of them, but we're starting to see, I'd say, signs of it leveling out. That's certainly the case here with the intermodal train speeds. But the good news is that we're in the ballpark now where average intermodal train speeds across the U.S. network are running about in line with the 5-year average and about in line with last year, actually a little bit better. So that's a good news item, and the first time that's happened so far this year. We are seeing, I think, still a decline in the number of intermodal trains that are being held for various reasons prior to departure, although a little bit of a leveling out here on that red line just in the most recent week. But that is at the end of a long decline, and we're only slightly above where we would have been if we look at the 5-year moving average. So again, I'd say a pretty good story here, but one where it looks like perhaps we're reaching a point of stability rather than continued decline. We are still seeing a decline in the number of loaded intermodal cars that haven't moved in 48 hours or more. That has not yet leveled out, but it's still fairly significantly above the 5-year average. So I'd say there's some distance to go before we get to that normalization point. The number of intermodal cars online has edged up somewhat in recent weeks, but again, is certainly not at a demanding level. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is the percentage of on-time arrivals defined as within 24 hours of schedule. And that number is significantly higher, as you can see, than it was 10 points higher than it was, say, at the middle of the year, but also shows some signs of leveling out. And most of the action here, if we're going to see further improvement, is going to have to occur on the western side because the eastern railroads are running already in the high 90s. That is in part due to, I think, the fact that 24 hours is too large a measure here. And so it's challenging to lose 24 hours on an eastern schedule. Now, here's something I haven't shared with you in quite a while, I think, and that's what is the average length of haul that's happening in intermodal. And I find this to be kind of a very useful trend because it tells us a little bit about what's going on with regard to market trends. The left-hand side is what the overall total intermodal length of haul is. And you can see the average length of haul is about 1,470 miles. So intermodal is a long-haul mode, without a doubt. But what's interesting to me is what's happening on this right-hand chart, which divides that number into the length of haul for IPI or for international, which is the blue, and the domestic, which is the greenish. And here you see that those two segments are moving in opposite directions when it comes to length of haul. Let's talk about the blue line first, which is the international line. And you see an overall declining trend that's happening, which is a function of the west to east migration and the average length of haul off the East Coast being shorter. So this is another sort of confirmation that the complexion of IPI is changing because of this west to east migration that's occurring in import TEUs. The other thing I'll point out on this blue line is this tremendous drop in length of haul that occurred late last year and early this year. And that was a function of the fact that the ocean carriers basically shut off IPI off the West Coast. So the East Coast was dominating at that point, and the length of haul was considerably shorter. The message on the domestic side is way different. You see quite a sustained, not dramatic, but sustained increase in length of haul. There was, I'd say, a fairly dramatic increase in the 2019 timeframe. That was the PSR modifications of the railroads backing out of a lot of short haul traffic that they didn't consider profitable enough. But even since then, you've seen kind of a general upward trend, and we're cracking the 1,500-mile length of haul. It may be, I think it's the first time ever since I've been tracking the numbers in the year 2000. Part of this is the decline in trailers, because trailer has a much shorter length of haul than domestic container. And then the other piece is just even if you just look at domestic container length of haul, that's lengthening out as well. So this is just an indication of the continuing trend towards, I'll say, and I'll call it a PSR related trend, towards the longer hauls that are easier to handle, and intermodal basically facing headwinds in the shorter length of haul, particularly now that truck capacity is more abundant. So there's quite a bit of information that one can gain from looking at this. We do that on a quarterly basis. Now, I want to spend a fair amount of time on these next two charts. And what we're trying to track here is, this is some analysis that I did for my report, Intermodal in Depth, to try and look at a longer term intermodal performance versus other benchmarks. And so what we're comparing here is both total intermodal, which is the red line, international intermodal is the light blue line, and domestic intermodal is the green line. We're comparing their performances versus long haul truck, which is purple, loaded import TEUs, which is light blue. I misspoke before. The international intermodal IPI is the dark blue line. Loaded intermodal TEUs is the light blue line, and the black line is what's happening with GDP. And the way that we're equalizing all of this, the way we're looking at it, is we take where things were in the year 2005 and look at the average for that by quarter for 2005, and we set that as an index of 100. And then we can see what's happened since then. And if you look at the overall intermodal in the most recent quarter, which is 2022 Q3, overall intermodal was about in about a 126 range, whereas even GDP is up above 130, so 30% above where it was in 2005. So total intermodal, if you look, has tracked, at least since the Great Recession, has tracked GDP pretty closely, was exceeding truck, was actually a little bit better than truck up until the recent events of the pandemic surge, and since then has fallen well behind truck if you look at what's happened in 2020. IPI, which is probably most directly comparable to what is going on with import TEUs, is way, way behind what import TEUs perform. They're up over 80%. And IPI is actually down about 10% from 2005. So there's been I'd say, a fairly significant disconnect. Domestic intermodal in green has been a good performer. It's performed much stronger over this long time frame than truck has, and much stronger than GDP. But now let's take a look at a more recent performance. So now we're doing the same analysis, except it's 10 years later. We're looking at 2015 instead of 2005. And how does that change the picture? Does it change the picture? And the answer is, it changes the picture pretty dramatically. And what you can see here, this is the same analysis, just a different starting point, is that overall intermodal, again in red, is really significantly trailing GDP, almost down to where it was in 2015. IPI is, again, well below where it was in 2015. And even domestic intermodal has underperformed versus GDP, significantly underperformed versus truck. And you can see where that happened. You can see that that trend started in end of 2018, beginning of 2019, when domestic intermodal began to go down as a result of the PSR restructuring. Then you saw a sort of a resurgence in the latter half of 2020, and it hung on until 2021, the middle of 2021, and that's when it basically topped out. And if you look at that green line, it kind of leveled out after 2021, and what happened is we ran out of capacity. We ran out of intermodal capacity. If you look at the purple line, which is truck, that did not happen with truck, and it was able to successfully scale up in a way that has not occurred ever in the time that I've been watching it. So there's a couple of messages here. One is stop talking about the driver shortage. This is perfect evidence that when the trucking industry needs to find drivers, it's going to find the drivers, and it did in a big way here. So for those who remaining in the audience who think that somehow there's going to be a driver shortage that's going to force traffic back onto intermodal, as we say in New York, I have one word for that: forget about it. It's not going to happen. In fact, both from a rail crew standpoint, there is a train crew shortage that has constrained our ability to grow, but not a driver shortage. So I guess what the message that I want folks to take away from this is that, we've seen a pretty significant disconnect develop between intermodal performance and both the GDP and the comparable numbers, whether it's import TEUs, IPI versus import TEUs, or truck volume, long-haul truck volumes, 500 miles or more versus domestic intermodal activity. And so in a way, I'll say that represents an opportunity, because it says, there's no reason, in my view, why we can't get back to the kind of performance that we were seeing up until 2019 if the industry decides it wants to do that. That may require some changes in the way that we're going into the market. And there are certainly some signs that that is occurring. We see some new projects, actually some pretty dramatic new projects being announced. We're seeing some of the railroad investor day presentations with, I'll say, from my view, a very welcome de-emphasis on operating ratio, and perhaps again hearing the old story of a pivot to growth, but maybe this time with a little more, I'll say I have a little bit more confidence that maybe it's for real. And I'm optimistically looking forward to what we see here in 2023, to see if we start to see some of those efforts begin to gain traction. Now, having said that, certainly the environment that the intermodal industry is going to be operating in 2023 is going to be a lot more challenging, at least from a market standpoint, maybe not necessarily an operational standpoint, capacity standpoint. That's going to be okay, but it's going to be challenging from a market standpoint, and we can talk about that more in a moment. So let's talk first about what's happening with regard to the overall markets. And there's no doubt, if you look at any mode, there's a slowdown that's underway. Now, a slowdown is not necessarily the same thing as a recession. But after we've been in this superheated environment for 2 years, even a return to normal is still going to feel pretty bad. So I guess I would say and this is, I guess, stating the obvious, that we're going to see that here in 2023. And so everybody needs to get ready for that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to heck. It just means maybe we're getting back to some semblance of normalcy. With regard to peak season, not this year. We have seen all of the freight that move early, and right now the focus is on reducing the inventory that's still clogging the warehouses, particularly on the retail side. And so I don't expect to see a late season surge. Of course, I could be surprised, but if so, I would have expected to see a little bit of that in the AAR numbers, and we haven't seen that. Now, one interesting question is, of all of this inflation that's currently in the headlines, how much of it is actually transitory? And I wrote this slide last week when I said I'm feeling optimistic. And it's interesting because the statistics that came out this morning tend to reinforce this. The statistics for the most recent month were a favorable surprise with regard to how low inflation was, but obviously way too early to declare victory. Those numbers jump around a lot, but I'm still on the optimistic side. That perhaps a bit more of the inflation that problems that we've seen were transitory rather than being embedded. The $64 billion question is what's going to happen with the economy next year. So far, we're seeing, I think, things holding up. And in general, folks maybe are a little bit more optimistic that that legendary, elusive soft landing can be achieved next year. I'm sort of on the fence on that one, but would like to be optimistic. Even if we just have that soft landing, the first point on this slide is still going to be valid, because one thing that is continuing to change is the mix of the economy moving more towards a service orientation. And so from a freight perspective, that's not necessarily a favorable mix change. So we may feel it a little more acutely than the GDP numbers might indicate. The last major theme I'll point to is that we're certainly seeing the change in where cargo is coming from. Folks are trying to disengage from China just as rapidly as they can. And truly, that's not very rapid, because it's very difficult to change supply chains in the kind of magnitude of disruption that this requires. This is a long-term trend that's happening here, and I don't see it reversing. I see it continuing, both in terms of moving away from China to other overseas origins, and as well the sort of the nascent infant trend towards nearshoring and onshoring, which seems to actually be gaining some real validity now, not just talk. So if we now look at the international side, from my perspective, it's pretty certain that we're going to have this very acute overcapacity situation with regard to the container ocean carriers. There's a tremendous amount of capacity coming on stream, coming out of the shipyards, just at the same time that overall volume is going down. A lot of that capacity is still in large vessels, mega ships, which I find personally kind of a puzzling choice, because if you see freight flows dispersing, it isn't necessarily logical to me to be getting the largest units of capacity that you can, because it's going to be more difficult to consolidate the flows. But I'm not an ocean guy. Maybe somebody there that has more knowledge in that sector can correct me on that. And the other thing I'll say is that we're going to see lots and lots of blank sailings, and I don't think that's going to be enough to sort of hold the market up. What that means is, from a freight reliability standpoint, we're going to continue to see a lack of reliability, because you never know when the voyage is going to sail or not, as these carriers are going to be struggling to try and keep a floor under the market. If there's a silver lining to all this, from the inland portion, which is where I spend my time, that this reduced volume is going to give us the opportunity to complete the operational reset that's already underway. And we are not going to be talking about congestion and chassis shortages next year unless we don't do our job, or there are other disruptive events like a polar vortex or some significant disruptions. And of course, one significant disruption that's hanging out there is what's going on with the West Coast labor talks. There seems to be very little signs of progress, and resolution is months away, at least based on what is appearing in the press. From an intermodal perspective, that's not good news. It's going to continue to fuel that west to east migration. Eventually, when there is the inevitable resolution here, some of that volume is going to come back to the West Coast, but not all of it. And the longer this goes on, the worse it gets. So it would certainly behoove the parties involved to try and move this process along. And I'm sure I'm not telling them anything they don't already know. The lack of progress so far is concerning. And the last thing I'll point out is IPI activity is lower thus far in 2020 than it was in 2015. We talked about that. Some of that is due to transloading. Not that we're seeing more transloading. It's just that transloading is held up better than IPI has for the most part. It's stickier. This transload volume out of the West Coast is holding firm. we're not seeing the migration that we are in the IPI activity to the east. And the last slide I'll talk to you about is what's going on with domestic and the major themes that I see there. First of all, I'll point out that domestic intermodal has not grown now since the end of 2018. So that's a pretty extended period of no growth. We're now coming into the fourth year. This starts to look more like a trend rather than just a series of special events. We can always point to special events, one thing or another that is holding us back. But I think that, and I believe it's already occurring. We're seeing, I think, some signs of a re-examination of intermodal's posture in the marketplace, and in my view, that is going to need to continue if we're going to get back on the growth track that everybody wants us to achieve. Right now, the situation is that we are still seeing good growth on the private domestic container fleet, and that's being fully offset by the declines that we're seeing in the rail-owned domestic container fleet and QFC. Now, I've said previously that one of the interesting aspects on the rail-owned side is that we're not seeing investment in new rail-owned domestic container capacity. We're seeing investment in chassis, we're seeing investment in tracking, but not in new equipment. But that actually is no longer the headline, because the decline that we're seeing in revenue moves with regard to the rail-owned fleet is well in excess of, I think, any decline that can be explained by equipment availability. And so what this is saying is that there is a shift that's occurring with regard to the marketplace, and rail-owned share is the demand for rail-owned movements is falling at a faster rate than let's say equipment is coming out of the system. So whether that is a market share shift that's occurring between non-asset players and asset players, potentially, or there's some pricing issues here, I think there are a number of potential explanations for what's happening, but there's no doubt that something is happening. As we start to get to the end of the QFC era, and we're now running about, 30% down year over year, the thing that I want to point out here is the stuff that's remaining in trailer is there for a reason. And so I expect that as the railroads continue to incent the migration of volume from trailer to container and eliminate trailer services, trailer lanes, that the percentage of that freight, of that TOFC freight that actually is retained, that percentage is going to go down. Because, for instance, if you see a 28-footer moving on the rail, the reason that 28-footer is that 28-foot container is, or trailer, I should say, is out there, is because it enables the parcel shipper or the LTL carrier to skip an intermediate sort location and build a load direct to a secondary destination. Since you don't have that kind of option of a 20-foot, 8-foot option in domestic container, you only need to go to a 53, then that means if they're going to convert that freight over to a 53, then they're going to have another sort, which affects their service and is very expensive. Handling the individual packages is expensive. So a higher percentage of those 28-footers are just going to go back to the highway in the form of doubles or even in some states triples, and leave intermodal when that option, if and when that option disappears. So that's my sort of canary in the coal mine with regard to the fact that some of this volume that we are thinking might convert to container is not going to convert to container, going to go back to the highway. Capacity is no longer an issue here, and that's going to be in spades next year, because as we hope and expect, equipment cycle times improve. We're still, right now, equipment cycle times are still elongated, because and this is true both international and domestic, when the container arrives on a chassis at a warehouse that's still chock full of the wrong merchandise, and the retailer hasn't been able to quite empty it yet, then that becomes a mobile storage unit. And as a result, the cycle time or the days out of the terminal are stretched because of this warehouse function that the equipment is fulfilling. And assuming that the retailers are going to be successful at sort of emptying out some of this warehouse stuffing inventory over the course of the balance of the holiday season, we should start to see this really start to moderate this next year. And what that's going to do is create a lot more capacity at a time when perhaps volume is going to be waning. So that will be certainly a very different kind of a feeling than we've had in recent years. And so my last advice is, as always, keep those seatbelts fastened. So with that, I'll close. I do want to make my shameless pitch. We go through a lot of stuff here on the, in a little bit of time on the Intermodal Analyzed, and I appreciate Ayanna giving me the megaphone. We go through a whole lot more depth in the written publication, Intermodal in Depth, which comes out both weekly with regard to the AR numbers and monthly with regard to the deep dive. It's about a 55-page report. And so I encourage our listeners here to take a look at the website, which is intermodalindepth.com. And we would love to have you take out a trial subscription for 6 months, $200 for an individual or $275 for a corporate subscription, and see what it is that we have to offer.
Thank you very much, Larry. Great stuff. Particularly good analysis and trying to wheedle out some answers in the data there. So we, as always, appreciate the work. We definitely have a lot of interesting questions. So let's go ahead and talk about chassis, because you're talking about the system blockages loosening up and the benefits of having a little bit of a release on the pressure of imports slowing down, hopefully helping the system kind of get back to equilibrium. So in terms of 53-foot or domestic chassis, are you seeing anything on that side regarding their availability and their location and how that's affecting the network?
I think that the chassis situation in general is easing up, both because there is new capacity that's flowing into the system. I mean, we went through a period here where, because of the tariffs on the Chinese originating new chassis, we were having to pivot to a domestic or non-China origins. And that, these things take time. And it didn't occur at a particularly favorable moment with regard to the market. But now volume is, production is coming up. We have new entrants into the manufacturing space at the same time that demand has certainly leveled off, and I think will ease off. Simply, even if volume stays up, just the better cycle times are going to basically create new chassis out of thin air. So, I'm sure there's still spot issues with regard to the near-term situation until we get through this last gasp of 2022. I expect we will not be talking about chassis shortages in 2023.
I certainly hope you're right, because that's one of the least popular things to talk about. But speaking of equipment as well, in terms of TEUs, the person uses the term stranded, and it's probably a decent question. They're estimating something like 4.3 million empty TEUs are stranded in the U.S. First of all, are you hearing that? How big a problem do you think that's going to be? And do you have any sense of who's absorbing the cost for that, which can't be cheap in terms of storing that much in empty cans?
Well, yes, the answer is yes. It's a problem. When we spoke at the IANA on the leadoff panel, Lars Jensen, I think, came up with this number, and he also provided an interesting sort of way to figure that number, which is that this 4.3 million TEUs is enough to build the wall between U.S. and Mexico 8 containers high across the entire U.S.-Mexico border. That's a lot of containers. I think it's a very legitimate question as to who's absorbing the cost. And the ocean carriers have been pretty good at externalizing costs and internalizing revenue. So the cost of this is being absorbed by other places in the chain than the ocean carrier. And the only way that this surplus gets dealt with is that the carriers need to take more containers out of North America than they are bringing in, which means they either have to run partially loaded ships in or run sweeper vessels to take these containers out. And they need a financial incentive to do that. And the East Coast ports, which are still struggling with inbound volume, have started to provide that incentive in the form of long-dwelling empty container fees. And what do you know? It's the number of containers that are dwelling is going down, and ocean carriers are running sweeper vessels to get these containers back overseas where they're needed eventually. And I think that that's really where it's got to be at, you know. And if there's a I'm a believer. This may not make me popular in certain circles, but I'm a believer that there is a role in some respects for regulation, to the extent that folks are penalized for things that are completely outside of their control. And I think that when a party, a corporate party, a player, an intermodal player is responsible for creating a problem, they should have responsibility for the expense associated with that problem. There may be a role for regulation in ensuring that that happens.
You had some foresight there, Larry, because that was one of the questions from one of the folks was there seemed to be a number of pending potential regulations or rulemaking by a number of the different government agencies. Do you have any thoughts on how likely those are to kind of make it through the rulemaking process, and how likely they are to change the way we do business, at least in the kind of medium term?
You know, I think whether or not actual rules get put in place, there is an influence factor of just the fact that this is happening. You know, we have a much more activist STB, we have a much more activist Federal Maritime Commission, and I say the industry ignores that at its peril. But it is possible to forestall it by taking, I'll say, a proactive approach and making folks feel a little bit more comfortable that they're being fairly treated. There is no ability of the Federal Maritime Commission or the STB to, I'll say, fix the supply chain crisis, to use that term. Zero ability. The only people that could do that are the people on this broadcast and, you know, within this industry. The only role that the regulators can play, in my view, is making sure that all the players get treated fairly and share the pain and share the benefits in a fair manner. And that's where I think the role for regulation is.
Yeah, we're big fans of a level playing field, and hopefully that will be the outcome, and not unintentionally putting a thumb on a different part of the scale. So just to shift back over, there seems to be a lot of interest in the shift to the East Coast in various angles on that. And one of the sort of reoccurring themes is, do you see that as being potentially related to shifts to other parts of the world, or at least away from China as a sole source of product?
Totally. You know, if you see volume moving into Southeast Asia or India or even Africa and Europe, that's volume that reaches the U.S. most naturally through the Suez Canal and hits the East Coast. So that is one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is the stuff that's coming in all water from, let's say, traditional Asia origins that comes in through the canal. Panama Canal comes around. And that's a function, I think, of A, right now, avoiding potential disruption, and B, what is the differential in the rates that the ocean carriers are setting to the East Coast versus the West Coast. And if you're in an overcapacity situation, it probably makes sense for the from an ocean carrier perspective to try and encourage East Coast, because you're going to soak up more capacity with the longer voyage times to go all the way through the canal and to the East Coast. So maybe that by reducing the differential, they can kind of help encourage that trend. And it wouldn't surprise me to see that even once the West Coast labor situation is resolved.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen a bit of is this notion of how is the actual infrastructure going to shift to these new source areas like India or Vietnam, what have you, in that China above all builds infrastructure really well, really quickly and really well. And how is an India or anyone else for that matter going to be able to pull off that sort of Great Wall style of building these ports from nothing to be able to get the goods out? So that's one question that I think kind of keeps coming up.
It is not going to be easy. And that's one reason why this change is occurring slowly. It's not only the port infrastructure and all of that, but it's also, I'll call it the supplier infrastructure. Within, if you're going to assemble a product in Vietnam, where are the parts coming from? In China, you have basically a one-stop shop. Everything is there at your disposal. That's, not to pick on Vietnam, but just use it as an example. I don't think it's true to the same extent in Vietnam, and so the products that you've seen migrate so far are the ones that are basically easy, like apparel and shoes and some things that don't require, I'll say, very extensive support infrastructure with regard to supplier base. And so I say life is going to be more complicated from a supply chain standpoint. These flows are not all going to you're going to have inbound and outbound flows, with components coming from A going to B, then final product going to C. It's not going to be easy.
Good news is intermodal plays pretty well in the automotive realm, and we've learned a lot from the folks in the automotive side about optimizing supply chains and moving goods back and forth as they come together. So hopefully we'll be able to.
And nearshoring and reshoring overall are intermodal tailwinds, not for IPI, but when you have a product that's being assembled here, then you have all of that inbound transportation also that represents an opportunity. So even though you might not have that long haul from LA to Chicago, you might have quite a bit of domestic activity occurring.
Yeah, and I know we're up against it, but there's definitely a couple more that I wanted to get in here. And to that point, there is one around the global marketplace for petrochemicals and particularly resins. And traditionally, the resins that have been created here in North America have been exported and then brought back in the form of various subproducts or what have you, but with the war in Ukraine, with the issues with China, do you see a growth opportunity for domestic intermodal, particularly in the central U.S., for picking up some of that resin business?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm looking. The reason I was looking away is I was opening a file, and one of the best sort of barometers for what's happening with regard to resin exports is what's going on in the Gulf Coast with regard to exports. And you're seeing some pretty healthy increases in recent months. That exports moved ahead of prior year in April, it looks like. And year-to-date exports through September, that's what I have, are up 5.7%. So that says that which is way better than any other region. So, I suspect that it's the resins that are driving that. Now, whether it makes sense to load that resin in a domestic container and take it to the West Coast and transload it there, versus take it out of the Gulf Coast. Well, that really depends on the particulars of the numbers there. I don't have any crystal ball with regard to that, but we're in a pretty commanding point with regard to our resin production. Unfortunately, one of the big markets there is China, and I don't know that they're going to be necessarily importing as much as they were.
Right.
So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. And then one last question. I'm going to combine two different ones and cheat a little bit. So my apologies to the two folks that were asking, but could you just touch a little bit on cross-border, both with Mexico and with Canada, and kind of what you see evolving there in the next quarter, 2 quarters, say?
Well, I mean, if you talk about those two markets, they're completely different because the Canadian-U.S. cross-border market is an IPI-driven market, and the Mexico-U.S. cross-border market is 100% domestic, at least for all practical purposes right now. Now, the cross-border Canadian situation, in fact, let's just take a look here real quick. So year-to-date, cross-border volume going across the U.S.-Canadian borders down a little more than 2%. So it's about in line, a little bit better than the overall. And the volume crossing the U.S.-Mexico border is up 9.4%. So we're seeing some strength there, but it's coming from a low point. It was really very, very badly hurt during the pandemic by the shutdown of the Maquiladora auto plants, and we're still in a recovery mode there. So some of that big year-over-year gain, I think, is a function of that. Now, if I look at the international containers, the IPI containers crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, year-to-date, they're up 579%. Yeah, which means that this year, there are 3,000, right? So you can't always just look at the percentages. But, you're seeing some experimentation in that market that I think there's going to be a continual flow there, especially once the merger happens between KCS and CP. But the overall volume there is very, very small. So even large percentage increases don't necessarily amount to a lot of volume. But I think that the U.S.-Mexico cross-border market is one that is ripe for growth. It's long haul, and I do think we're going to see some more aggressive market actions, both coming as a result of the merger and response to the merger. So it's going to be one of the ones that I'll be keeping my eye on here in the coming year.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Larry, thank you so much. A great session as always. I think we all learned a lot and had some great discussions, as is our habit on these. We've kind of grown to love this periodic check-in. If folks are interested in the IANA data, which Larry taps a whole lot in his research to put these sessions on, you can look at either the volume analyzer, which there are a couple of different flavors of that to help you crunch the numbers yourself, and also the ETSO database, which is the raw baseline data that we use significantly. So if you're interested in either of those, intermodal.org, data and statistics, or shoot us an email at info@intermodal.org. I would also encourage you to check out Larry's publication. I think it's a lot of great information in a very timely manner. With that, I would like to wish everybody a happy holiday season. And I will say this, that I'm excited to have Larry back for another season of Intermodal Analyzed in 2023. With that, we look forward to seeing you in the new year, and come on back to IANA, the connecting force behind intermodal freight.